And we put to death the flesh by means of the Spirit. That means we are dependent upon the Spirit of God. We might have barriers and boundaries and things that we establish, but we never trust in that boundary or that barrier more than we trust in Jesus to help us deal with sin in our lives. All throughout the New Testament, in Paul's epistles, there's this constant put off, put on, put off, put on, put off, put on. Because that's always the call to mortify or to kill sin in our lives. Think about the reality of this. It is literally impossible to pursue Jesus while at the same time pursuing sin. They are so antithetical, they are so opposite that I can't be walking this direction and walking that direction at the same time. The deceitful thing is I might be looking at Jesus but all the while moving towards my sin. That's why we need each other. That's why we need the community of the Christian life. That's why we don't want to forsake that. That's why we don't want to forsake this book. Because sin is so deceitful. Our hearts are so deceitful that we can think we're doing one thing and doing another.
Yeah.
One person says this: if you can look on sin without sorrow, you have never looked on Christ. We are called to look at Jesus, and we've just celebrated the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And we're called to look upon the man of sorrows, the one who cried from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The man who was scorned and ashamed and mocked. And he did all this to bear the weight of our sin. We're called to appreciate what Jesus has done for us. And if we can pursue sin without any reservation for the man of sorrows, man, we've got it all wrong. We don't really understand what Jesus has done for us. And we all struggle with sin. It's not like we're going to arrive to perfection at some point in this life, but we are called to look to Jesus. So we're given instruction, we're given an example, we're given instruction. The third advice or instruction that the author gives us, I think, is the most obvious, but the most obvious is sometimes the thing we need most reminding of. The thing that's just kind of, it's like looking for ketchup in the refrigerator. It's right there, but you just can't ever see it. So you, hey, where's the ketchup? It's right there. Oh, yeah. You don't see it. It's the obvious thing staring you in the face. The third advice or instruction that the author gives us is that we must run the race set before us. Look at this third section in verse 1. "And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." A couple of things here to note is that what we need to do is we need to run with endurance. The whole context of what this author is doing is he's giving us all these metaphors of race and context and contest and these challenges and running and this witness, all these people surrounding and looking, just this sports metaphor that he's using. And I mean, if Americans know anything, we know about sports, right? It doesn't matter what sport it is, we know about it. But think about this. The New Testament offers tons of different metaphors for the Christian life. You get to the letter of Ephesians. Paul doesn't talk about running, Paul talks about walking. Walk in a manner worthy of your calling. Walk, walk, walk. We're talked about, in metaphorical terms, the marriage that we have with Christ. We talk about the body of Christ. There's all kinds of metaphors used, but in particular, in this context of suffering and the threat of persecution and challenge, the author wants us to run. But not just to run with endurance. This prepositional phrase, "with endurance," is the instrumentality by which we are to run. Not just run, don't just go out and run down the block, but run with endurance, because the course set before you isn't a mile, it's not 2 miles, it's the entirety of your life. The famous bumper sticker phrase, "the Christian life isn't a sprint, it's a marathon." It's actually one of the few bumper stickers that's true. But what does it mean? What does it mean to run with endurance? The word literally means the capacity to hold out or bear up in the face of difficulty. To hold out or to bear up in the face of difficulty. Words like patience, fortitude, steadfastness, perseverance come to mind when we talk about endurance. The author of Hebrews is aware of the need for perseverance or endurance in the Christian life. Again, his concern is that either by the intensity of pressure or the longevity of that pressure, these believers will somehow drift away, or over the course of time drift away from the pursuit of Christ. Think about the way that the author has talked throughout this epistle to the readers. One commentator says this: the readers are encouraged not to drift away, Hebrews 2. They're not to neglect, Hebrews 2, the message of salvation, not to fail to reach the Christian goal, chapter 4, not to lose hold of the faith they confess, chapter 4, not to lose their confidence, chapter 10, not to become dull of understanding, chapter 5, not to become sluggish, chapter 6, and so on and so on and so on. He gets the reality of the pressures that they're facing and the temptation to slowly let the circumstances of life outweigh who Jesus is. He says we must be careful here, because the reality is we could make one slight misstep here and think about endurance as being our work. We could say that endurance is dependent upon us in the sense that it's a works righteousness-based system. But when he invites us with this instrumentality, with endurance, what he's asking us to do, what he's encouraging us to do, is to continually rely upon the grace of Christ. The endurance is to continually cling to and hold to and stand fast to Jesus. It may at some points in time require, effort that we throw out on our part, which is true. But in the midst of exerting that effort, it can't ever be separated from clinging to Jesus. We endure in our pursuit of Christ in the same way we began, by faith given to us in God's grace. It's always by grace. It's always by faith. So not only what we need, but what we do. We must run with endurance the race that is set before us. The race that is set before us. Again, the idea of race always sets forth this idea of competition and challenge. And there's several components, at least that I remember from my time in high school. I ran track and cross country. I remember difficulties faced in those two events. And three of these things come to mind. One of the difficulties is the course and its rules. So as we're getting ready to run this race, if you ever ran track, or if you at least have an understanding, track is a circle, right? If you start at the starting line and you take off right, you're going the wrong direction, right? It's only left-hand turns in track. If you only run the 100, it's just a straight line. But generally speaking, there's some turns in there. You don't get to pick the rules for this race. Right. The Christian life set before you. God has established the course. God has established the rules. God's given you the course. When I was in high school, I thought I was smarter than my coaches, and so we were out running once, and they gave us a certain path to go, and I thought they would never know if I went a little bit shorter. Unfortunately, they did know that I went a little bit shorter, me and a couple of friends, and so we decided we're going to cut the corner. And so instead of running 5 miles, it turned into an 8-mile run. It's like, oh, you don't want to run at all. Well, let's run some more. So we ended up running more. But the idea is there for us is that this is the course. This is the race set before us by God. We don't pick the rules. We don't pick the path. It's set out, laid out before us. It's our call to follow. Another thing that we struggle with in the context of a race is the distance of the race itself and the strategy involved to win. Okay? I ran distance, so I ran 800 mile, 2 mile, or cross country was 5K at that time. I don't know what it is now. You run the 2 mile different than you run the 100. You run the 2 mile different than you run the 400. The 400 is literally the worst race ever invented. That's one lap around the track, and it's a combination between endurance and all-out sprint. Okay, so by the time you round to 200, you're like, well, I should be done by now at the level of intensity I've been putting in. But there's a whole other 200 meters you have to run. And so that's where the endurance comes in, because you bear up underneath the pressure and your body giving way and your legs feeling like jello to press on further and further and faster and harder and stronger. And so that's the strategy for that race. But the strategy for our race is long-term pursuit. It is a faithfulness of step by step, day by day, continually pursuing Jesus. It's not go out as fast as you can and then take a break in 5 minutes. The race we are called to is a lifelong endurance competition to the end. A lifelong pursuit of clinging to Jesus and the grace that He's given us to one day reach Him, to one day come to Him. And then there's the competition itself. In this metaphor, I mean, we're not competing against one another. We're not looking at each other like opponents or challengers, but our opponent, the competition we face, is our flesh. The flesh versus the Spirit is the constant struggle we face. Later on, if you have time, read through Hebrews chapter 10 again, and it captures that as well. But the thing to understand is that there's nothing passive about a race. If you're watching the race, you're not in the race. If you're running and if you're exerting, you're in the race. You know that you're in the race. If you're a cheerleader on the side, you're not in the race. Okay, you're not really in the race. It requires effort. So far, we've seen that we are to remember others who have done the same. Second, we are to lay aside anything that hinders us. Third, we are to run the race set before us. Lastly, I want us to see that we are to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus in verse 2. What does it exactly mean to look on or to fix our eyes upon Jesus? I think there's 4 truths we can draw out from this, and we'll look at these in due course. Look at verse 2 with me. Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. The focus or the attention of us in the midst of the race is a vital issue. Again, when I ran cross country, my coach's advice to me was kind of a 3-stage process. At the start, when you're all lined up and there's 100 other runners and you're getting there and you're getting loosened up, you don't want to be looking left and right and seeing who, you want to focus in on the guy that's about 50 meters in front of you with a gun. And all of your attention, all of your focus, all of your adrenaline is aimed at listening for that. When you hear that, you go. But if you're looking left, looking right, looking left, if you're looking around, if you're thinking about, oh, did I tie my shoe or anything like that, you've already lost the race. If you don't start well, typically you don't finish well. I'm sure there are exceptions to that rule. But then the other advice that they gave was, as you're running, in cross country, you have lots of time to make up distance. You have lots of time to make things up. So as you're running, the idea is that you focus on the person in front of you. And as you focus on them, you watch their heels, you begin to match their pace. And once you've matched their pace, you can draw up enough, okay, just a little bit faster. And so that's how you catch people over a long period of time. But your focus is on the person in front of you. Near the finish line, you never look behind you. You never look for your parents in the stand. You never look for your girlfriend. You just run. and you don't look for anything but what's in front of you. And the goal of what the authors of Hebrews is saying is in this pursuit, in this constant struggle of running towards Jesus, you don't ever once take your eyes off of Jesus. You run as fast and as hard as you can. When you round that last corner in track, you just run until you throw up. That's what you do. Whatever race it is, you just run until you throw up. That's the mentality you take into that race. The author of Hebrews is saying, fix your eyes upon Jesus. This fix your eyes upon literally translates to direct one's attention without distraction. We live in an age of distraction, do we not? You don't have to drive probably very far down 70 to see these big yellow signs. Don't text and drive. And there's a whole reality of importance behind not texting and driving. Okay, so that's the sub-message in this point. The reason they tell us not to text and drive is because of the danger of that distraction for you and for others. And you cannot discount the danger of that. But I want you to think of, if that's dangerous, think of how dangerous it is to lose sight of the supremacy of Jesus. It is far more dangerous to lose sight of Jesus in your pursuit of Him than it is to text and drive. As dangerous as that is, and do not do that, but the reality of losing hold of Jesus is eternally dangerous. We are called to run with focus, with blinders, with such concentration and vision that we see nothing else but Jesus. And our lives are constantly filled with distraction. We can't be deterred by difficulty. We can't be distracted by sin or weights that encumber us. The goal of our life, the goal of our pursuit is always Jesus. Ray Ortland Sr. told his son, Ray, this shortly before he passed away: ministry isn't everything, Jesus is. If you're going to go into the ministry full-time, part-time, anytime, that is the most valuable quote to carry with you. Ministry is not everything, Jesus is. And you, as you study here at Brooks and you gain your education and you gain knowledge, if you come out with A's and come smarter, but you come away not knowing more about Jesus, you failed.
Yeah.
The thing that prepares you most for Jesus is the thing that prepares you most for ministry is a better understanding of Jesus. I mean, you want to learn all that you can here, and you want to take in soak all the information and the wisdom that you can, but let it drive you closer to Jesus. There was a point in time in my life where academics was a huge thing to me. I was working on classes of various forms, and it became the controlling mechanism for my life. My value and my worth were determined by it. And so when I went to speak or I went to do something, it was I need to impress people with what I know. I need to impress people with the context of what's going on. And there's this old story about these two preachers who walk up to the pulpit, and they're, one preaches and the next one preaches, and they're preaching from Psalm 23. The first guy, he's young, fresh out of seminary, and he preaches, and he exegetes, he shows all the Hebrew parsing and does all this stuff, and people are like, yeah, that was pretty good. The next guy gets up, he's been in ministry his whole life. And he doesn't talk about the definitions of anything, he doesn't talk about anything, and everybody in the audience is just overwhelmed by his message. The younger man comes up and says, hey, what did you do there? He said, you may know Psalm 23, but I know the shepherd of Psalm 23.
Come on.
You want to know Jesus more than you want to know anything else. If you can parse participles and all that, that's great, but it's got to point you to Jesus. That's not a knock on language study or anything like that, but don't make that the primary.
Right.
Let that always be the motivation to push you closer to understanding Jesus. So again, ministry isn't everything, Jesus is. Next, he wants us to look at what Jesus has accomplished. He's the founder and perfecter of our faith. This word founder means that he's the originator of, and he's also the leader. A pioneer is sometimes how this word can be translated. The emphasis here falls on the example of confident faith that Jesus gives us in his life and his ministry. I love to look into the Gospels and to see the faith demonstrated by Jesus. When he stands the temptation of Satan in Matthew 4, man, he quotes Scripture. He never once loses sight of or is distracted by Satan's temptation. I love when he's with his disciples in the boat as they're going across the Sea of Galilee, and he's asleep and he's knocked out as can be. The waves start to overtake the boat, and the disciples, help us, do you not care that we are perishing? And Jesus, wakes up, like, what's going on here? Jesus' faith was demonstrated in that he knew the purpose and plan of God for his life wasn't to end in that boat.
Right.
He could sleep through any storm, and then he rebukes the winds and waves, and then he questions the disciples, what is this? What faith do you not have yet? They didn't fully understand the picture and plan of God. Jesus is the perfect example of faith, but he's also the originator, the founder, the leader of our faith that gives us the prime example because he accomplishes the race.
Yeah.
He ran the race set before us, and he's opened up the path for us to follow. Not only is Jesus the supreme example of faith by leading in origination, he is also the perfect example of faith perfected. So what exactly does that mean? The perfecter of our faith means one who brings something to a successful conclusion. One commentator describes it this way: by the single offering of himself to God, Christ was perfected through suffering and obtained perfection for all who believe and obey in him. The law and the cultic system were unable to perfect anyone, but here, faith itself is perfected. There's this great hymn, it's old, but it's been redone of recent, He Will Hold Me Fast. It's a beautiful song. But it talks about the struggle that we have, that we need Jesus to hold us fast, because we will want to drift. We will want to walk away. We want to be challenged, and that challenge is dangerous for us. Next, we are to look at what Christ endured. First, we are to consider what Jesus endured in the sense that there's this pattern, he sets this pattern of looking beyond what's present to see what's in the future. Look again at verse 2. Looking to Jesus, the primary focus of this verse, then descriptors, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. The joy that was set before him, the thing that was held out before him, was what because he had a perspective of future joy, he was able to endure the cross. And that phrase, endure the cross, is really just a shorthand for the passion narratives we find in the Gospels. It's descriptive of the absurd trials that he faced before Pilate and the high priest. It describes the torment of lashings he bore. It describes the crucifixion itself. And it describes the propitiatory nature of Jesus' sacrifice. In other words, endured the cross is describing the extreme suffering that Jesus endured. A suffering yet these readers had not yet felt. Look at verse 4. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. So they've resisted, they've endured, but they haven't endured to the end. They haven't faced everything they might potentially face. Then it says something extremely ironic in verse 2. That they despising the shame. Not only was the physical suffering in the crucifixion and in Christ's death, but there was immense shame that came with crucifixion. Something that was scorned and mocked, the person who was crucified. There's deep irony in this phrase. Jesus looked at or stared down the shame of the cross and despised it. The thing that the world would shame, the thing that the world would laugh at, the thing that the world would mock, Jesus looked at all that and despised it. In other words, he considered something not important enough to be an object of concern when he evaluated it against something else. The shame was not important enough to concern Jesus when he considered the outcome of his suffering and shame. Think about that as we are called to run with endurance and we're called to look upon Jesus, is that at some point in the next 5 minutes, you're going to be faced with a challenge. Temptation, struggle to speak the truth, whatever the case might be, and you're going to have to realize that you have to follow the example of Jesus, to look beyond this, to see the joy that lies before you, and despise the shame and the mocking and everything that might come with it, because the value of being obedient, the value of following Christ. Then he says that we are to look to Jesus' reward. The joy set before Jesus was his reward. His reward was faithfully serving his Father and the glory and exaltation that came with him coming back to the right hand of the Father. John 17, 4 and 5 says this, I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. And now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. Thomas Schreiner, in his commentary on Hebrews, says this, the cross was despised in the ancient world and a shameful way to die. The application to the reader is clear. They too must endure to the end, being willing to endure any suffering, since they know they will ultimately enjoy a great reward. So we've seen what the author of Hebrews has done for us. He's given us these various instructions on how to live, how to persevere, how to continue in the race of the Christian faith in the midst of challenges and persecutions and difficulties that we might face. So I want us to just be reminded of this little passage that's full of